Welcome back, everybody. The final episode, part 3 of 3. Check out the first two parts talking about playoff picks, 2023 109 through 112, and the mid round picks, 2023 105 through 108. This is Dynasty Leverage talking about 2023 rookie picks. And part of this exercise, just to kind of recap what's already been done, I went through and pulled mock draft data from 6 different sites, put it all together and came up with an average and trying to forecast what the class is going to look like and what to do if you have picks in this range. So listen to those other two videos if you think your pick may fall late, may fall in the middle. And honestly, I think a lot of people look at their picks and say, you know what, I'm going to be safe and say that it's probably going to be a mid first. And then you kind of have an arrow going up and down based on the direction of your team. Now, we're going to get into this talking about what to do if you think you are sitting on a high first round pick next year. And essentially, the draft data speaks for itself. Using this mock draft data, we have 5 skill players projected to go inside the top 10. Obviously, CJ Stroud, Bryce Young, 2 receivers with Kayshon Boutte and Jaxon Smith-Njigba. And then we also already know about Bijan Robinson and to a lesser extent Jahmyr Gibbs, but I think based on their draft capital, have a really good shot of falling inside this range, potentially top 4 picks for Jahmyr Gibbs, and obviously the favorite to be 101 at this point with Bijan. So if you're sitting on an early first, not only do you have a shot at getting an elite player with elite draft capital relative to their position, but you're also sitting on the ability to have options, right? If you land the 101, you're going to have the ability to pick anybody in a class. Historically, the 101 has pretty much held its value across the board, regardless of the strength of the class. Look at this year. The entire class, for the most part, was being faded, but the 101, still relative to the rest of the league, was essentially worth a high second round startup pick, or at least a second round startup pick, depending on how fast the quarterbacks came off the board in your given league. So the real question becomes is the 102, the 103, the 104. Why is there more leverage in those picks other than that they're higher than the 105, 106, 107? Well, it's because I think that you get first crack at any quarterback that hits elite draft capital. You get the first crack at any running back that fits into this range slash has the profile that everybody is going to chase. Look back at 2020 where all the running backs got pushed up. I've used that class as an example because, the last couple of years we've seen this trend with wide receivers taking over the most valuable spots in Dynasty. But in that class, this was before the market shifted, and that's going to be one of the interesting things that happens next year with these running backs. Is it's a very, very friendly market for wide receivers. However, when you can hit on these types of running backs in the rookie draft, it's actually worth more, or at least I'm trending towards thinking it's worth more if you can hit on these elite running backs because they are largely only available in rookie drafts because the price to pay on the open market relative to the capital that you probably want to spend is far too high. So I think that's where the advantage really comes. Obviously, if you hit the 101, big advantage. If you hit the 102 and you get to pick anybody but Bijan, you essentially can say, okay, I get to pick any running back, any quarterback, any wide receiver. You have the leverage there just simply by having the choice. So you're already protected. You're already protected by the fact that it's going to be really hard to say that the top 4 picks next year aren't valuable. It's just going to matter where do you pick in that range? How much leverage do you have in terms of positional choice? I mentioned the 5 players going in the top 5. So this data has Cam Ward going in the top 10. Now, Cam Ward, based on this, would be QB3 off the board. So I think part of the strategy there is understanding it might not be Cam Ward. But as I mentioned in the previous video, it's probably going to be a quarterback, if not another quarterback. So I think that's where the value of these picks come in. Maybe the 104, 105, 106, you're going to have choices at what position you take, and they're still going to have the draft capital on their side. You want a receiver? There's probably going to be 2 receivers that go inside the top 15 picks, which makes historical hit rates pretty high for those types. There's going to be maybe 3 or 4 quarterbacks that go in the top 15, kind of similar to 2021. So that's going to essentially give you pretty insulated top 8, top 10 picks at quarterback, especially if they have the Konami code or the ability to run, which Will Levis, Cam Ward to a lesser extent, and Anthony Richardson. All those guys have that. So again, if that ends up being a couple of those guys inside the top 15, you're going to have 2 more players that the community is going to see. Wow, these guys are at least mid first, if not higher, based on the scarcity and the need of quarterback in my given league. So you're sitting on one of these picks. What do you do? People have asked me, when do I shop these picks? Now, obviously, if you get the 101, that's a different story than if you have the 103, 104. If you're clearly not the best team in your league and you're kind of sitting there going, well, I know I'm going to have a non-playoff pick, but I'm not sure if it's going to be top 3, top 4, or maybe it's right on the fringe of missing the playoffs and it's the 105 or the 106. What's the trade value of one of these picks? This is the one that I've struggled with the most. I mean, I did those other 2 videos essentially right off the cuff because most of my teams, honestly, have those picks that are inside the bottom 4, or bottom 4 meaning the last 4 picks of the round, or at least they're in the range where I go, you know what, I'm probably the 4th or 5th best team in this league. So it's probably one of those mid first. It could go both ways. I'm hesitant to just give it away, but I also understand that that pick could go both directions during the season. It could be one where I go, man, things are going bad. Let me hold on to it because I think it's going to be, in the bottom half, 104, 105, 106, or man, my team started off really hot. This may end up being a late first. Let me try to move it. So I have a lot of picks in that range, and then a lot of picks obviously near the back of the draft where I already know it's going to be late. Leagues where I've won like 2 years in a row. Obviously, the league is going to look at my first rounder next year and go, you know what? It's probably not one I'm thinking I'm going to get Bijan with. So it's almost irrelevant that we have these high draft capital players, at least based on these projections in the rookie class when you're trying to trade away one of those picks. Now, what do you do if you have one of those picks where you go, yeah, you know what? This is just not a good team. Do you even shop that pick? And I think that is the tough question. That's actually one I had to think through before I recorded this video because I think most people would go, you know what? No, because the shot at getting the 101 is extremely valuable, right? If you just have a 1 in 4 shot at getting the 101, you already know you're going to be in the bottom 4. But if you have a 1 in 4 shot of getting the 101, which potentially could be worth 3 firsts, it's hard to say, well, let me shop that pick. Now, let me get into a little bit what I was talking about earlier. Here's what I think is going to be the interesting point about this class, right? If you end up with the 101, let's just say the 101 right now, you're lucky you end up with the 101. You're sitting on the golden goose. You're sitting on potentially Bijan. And I'm assuming Bijan is going to get this draft capital too. I think most people probably assume if he gets good draft capital, he will be the 101 in most drafts. At least that's what it'll look like leading up to probably when your draft takes place. Now, does the person on the clock actually do that? I don't know. It'll be interesting if you're in one of these leagues where it's like a 14 team super flex. Does the person consider a quarterback in that spot just because of the scarcity of the position? And it's not like they're taking a bad profile at quarterback. If they take like CJ Stroud and he's the 101 in the NFL and the scarcity is at quarterback, you can see where somebody might take them over Bijan. But I think the point is, if you end up with that pick, what is it going to be worth on the open market? That is what I am most curious about. Because I sit here and I go, what is Bryce Hall worth on the open market? What is Jonathan Taylor worth on the open market? What is Najee Harris, Javonte Williams? What are those guys worth on the open market? Now, I think our judgment is a little clouded with the 2023 picks because they are so valuable. When you equate what is Bryce Hall worth in 2023 picks, it's not 3 firsts. It's just not. And there's not many players in Dynasty other than quarterbacks and maybe Chase, Jefferson, Pitts that are approaching 3 firsts or more value. Obviously, the quarterbacks at the high end are worth more than that. But it's really those guys and that's it that anyone would consider giving 3 firsts for. And I think a lot of people would even consider if you can get 323 firsts for Kyle Pitts or Jamar Chase, like you still might just do that. Even though you have one of the elite assets, you might do that given how powerful the 23 picks are. So what do you do if you want to have one of these picks? How do you trade it? What if you have one of these picks and you're a good team? You just happen to have somebody else's pick that you're looking at their roster and you go, man, they only have 2 quarterbacks. One of them is Deshaun Watson. One of them is Daniel Jones. They thought they were going to be middle of the pack, but now I'm looking and I'm going, I'm actually okay betting on that being like at the very, very top of the draft board. Let me see if I can shop that pick with the expectation. And this is the key part, with the expectation that the league is valuing the pick in that range. That's the difference. Is a lot of times I look at picks and maybe the way that I judge how good a team is going to be based on looking at their pick is a little bit different. I tend to look at the quarterbacks. I tend to look at the onesie spots or the places where you have the highest warp. So quarterbacks, but then I look at the high end running back and the high end tight end. Does this team have Travis Kelce, Jonathan Taylor, and 2 top 12 quarterbacks. They could have a terrible roster other than that, not a lot of depth, but if they have that, it's hard for me to bet on that team just being at the very, very bottom, barring that they don't just blow up the roster. So I think that's the thing is I look at maybe the strength of the team a little bit differently. I'm looking at it in buckets. I'm looking at the positional advantages that they have amongst how many starters there are. So if there's 11 starters and they have those 4 positions locked down, that's probably a team that can just kind of get by with replacement level value at the other spots and still maybe they don't make the playoffs. Maybe with some bad luck or an injury to one or two, they don't make the playoffs, but it's going to be hard for me to see them just being the 101. So I don't really look at that pick that way. But if there's another team where I go, man, they have a little bit of depth, they have a bunch of average players, right? That's the team that normally comes out of nowhere to be the 101, the one that has the most average players. You look at their roster and you go, like, they don't really have like any top 40 or 50 assets. They have an okay lineup. They may start pretty hot out the chute. Maybe they win 2 out of 3 games to start the season. You're like, okay, that's an average team. Those are the ones you want to target, the ones that are just average at quarterback. They have maybe some point scoring assets, but they don't have a lot of value. They're very, very quick to drop off the cliff if they were to have an injury. That's the type of team you like to bet on to crack the top 2 or 3. And maybe they don't view it that way. Maybe they look at their roster, they go, I have a lot of depth. I have a couple wins to start the season. This could be a playoff pick. And then they trade it away. Those are the ones you're looking to buy if you're looking to buy in this range. If you're looking to sell, it's tough. It's got to be one of those situations where you have a bad team's pick. You view it that way. The market also views it that way. And you can essentially go, hey, I'm selling what looks like to be a top 2 or top 3 pick. And I think you kind of have to be steadfast. Even if it's not the 101, you have to account for the fact that it could be the 101. Maybe it isn't the favorite to be the 101, but if it looks like it's a top 3 or 4 pick, you have to at least add a little bit of value on top of it to trade it away because it's like it has it has a catcher's chance to be the 101. Maybe it's only 20%, but it's got a chance. It's got one roll of the die to see if they can come up with a specific number. So you have to factor that in. So I think the value, honestly, if you're just looking at comparable players, right? If you're just looking at Stroud, Bryce Young, and let's just say one quarterback 3, I don't know who it's going to be, but you're looking at 3 guys that are probably going to carry Justin Fields, Trevor Lawrence, that type of value going into the season. So immediately, now I'm not saying they should be this way, but this is how the market's going to value them. Top 18 quarterbacks to start, maybe a little bit higher depending on the landing spot, depending if they all get that top 10 draft capital. That's a little different than Fields. Remember, he fell. But imagine if Fields would have gone like 103 to San Francisco instead of Trey Lance, or Fields would have gone in the top 5. That might have changed things a little bit on how he'd be being viewed. And we might see that next year. So if these draft projections hold, we're going to be less worried about the landing spot and more going, okay, this guy was still a top 10 pick. That's different than a quarterback we like going, pick 22 in the first round. It's slightly different in terms of historical hit rates. So you have to keep that in mind. Like, you have to also see that value in the pick, and you have to kind of put it out there to your league that that's how you're seeing it. Then you have to add the value on top of it and say, well, it has a 15 to 20% chance of being the 101. I have to add a little bit to that. So I think the way that I go about moving these picks, if I have them, if it's not my team, I think that's obvious. If you think you're going to be in the top 3, probably isn't the time to move the pick quite yet, unless you were just getting a package of cornerstone players, or at least like 2 players that potentially could be cornerstone players. Even then, I hesitate to go, I'm going to trade away my early first next year for 2 mid-level assets. Maybe not a single top 20 player in the deal, but a couple top 40 players in the deal. You're sitting there going, well, do I really want to trade this pick away for Cortland Sutton and Jalen Waddle in the same trade? And I think a lot of people would go, that's pretty appealing. And it would be if you could get that type of deal for a mid to late first or a random first. But if you're sitting there going, this is going to be an early first, I still hold if I'm getting that type of deal. If I trade it away, I need to get probably top 3 startup round value. It has to be at one of the high warp positions. So it has to be at a position, running back, tight end, quarterback, preferably quarterback, because I don't necessarily want to buy running backs on the open market either, right? Because I kind of assume with this pick next year, I can get a running back with this selection. So why do I want to go buy a running back unless I have the opportunity to get like Bryce Hall or Javonte Williams, or a package where someone maybe throws another player plus another running back like DeAndre Swift or something like that. And I think most people would go, wow, I don't really want to give up, a pick and just get back a couple mid-lane pieces. But if someone came with Swift and another player, I would consider it. But look at this. Like, I kind of look at one of the running backs in this class and you go, you can probably get another DeAndre Swift. Do you really want to buy Swift as he is on a team you're not sure what's going to happen? And on a team where essentially you're just buying a couple extra years at running back on top of what you already have. You're not getting the discount with the years. You're paying market price for the years that already exist, and you're getting another year worth of equity in that running back that's not going to help you. You're probably not going to contend, given you thought your pick was going to be on the high end of the range. So I think you kind of got to look at this. It's got to be real specific. This has to be, here's the move. It comes down to quarterbacks. There's very few tight ends I'd be interested in paying one of these picks for. It's got to almost be Pitts. Quite frankly, it almost has to be a deal with Pitts where I can add this early first next year to something to get Kyle Pitts. I'm fine with that. That's the one insulated asset. I guess you could say the same thing about Chase or Jefferson, but really my focus will be quarterbacks. I think the real actionability with this quarterback class coming up and the high first round picks is you're going to get shots at quarterbacks. There's no doubt. There are going to be quarterbacks there. If you have the 102 through the 104, assuming Bijan goes 101, you are going to have access to quarterbacks. The question is, do you want to take the quarterback at what their current market price is going to be? And I think people are still going to be scared off about 2021, Lance and Fields and Lawrence and Zach Wilson. If you would have just followed draft capital, you lost equity in every one of those assets except for Trey Lance, who essentially didn't lose any value because he didn't play. So the recency bias says, you know what, people are going to still hold that against this 23 class, no matter how high they get drafted, no matter how much hype they get, the expectations are going to be tempered just a little bit coming out of the chute compared to what it was in 2021. 2021, we jumped the shark. We were valuing Trey Lance, Trevor Lawrence, and Justin Fields as top 12, top 10, Lawrence's case, top 6 quarterbacks in Dynasty. It was crazy. Lawrence was going ahead of Joe Burrow in startups. He was going inside the top 6 picks in startups. I was in numerous startups where Lance, Fields, and Lawrence went in the first round of the startup. And it was just quarterback, quarterback, quarterback. Now, they were still like QB 7, 10, and 11, but they still went in the first round of the startup draft. And that was a mistake. People are not going to forget that. It's not going to be less than 2 years for them to just do it again. So the value on the quarterback class next year, even if there are 3 QBs in the top 10 and 2 in the top 3, they are not going to be valued higher than they were in 2021. People are going to be a little scared drafting the rookie quarterback and just betting on them to smash. Now, maybe expectations will be a little bit different in terms of maybe I get the upside value later, but I don't draft these guys just to start day one and they're going to smash. Not every guy can go out and be Justin Herbert. And I think we got a little spoiled with that, and thus we overcorrected in the 2021 class and did the same thing. So I think that's how you approach these picks. I think it's actually to alleviate the risk at quarterback for that reason. If we know the community is going to put the quarterbacks at the high end of this rookie class in 23 at the top of the dynasty ranks, just naturally, we're going to put Bryce Young at QB 10, CJ Stroud at QB 9, Anthony Richardson or Will Levis or Cam Ward at QB 15 or 16. We already know that's going to happen, but the trade equity isn't the same. You should say on paper, I can go get insert quarterback, whatever, Trevor Lawrence for that pick. But I don't necessarily think that's the move that you want to make, but that's what the ADP is going to look like next year. So I think if I'm using these picks, it is to address my quarterback room. It is to alleviate me being tempted, because I'm going to be tempted next year. If I have the 103 and I see that the latest ADP has CJ Stroud at QB 9 in Dynasty and he's in my lap and I have the shot at hitting on another Mahomes or, even another Dak Prescott, I'm going to take that again. I'm going to fall for the bait like I did in 2021. So how do I alleviate that? How do I remove that uncomfortable feeling, especially if you have multiple leagues and you have multiple picks in this range? I think what I'm doing is I'm probably looking to shore up my quarterback room with that pick. And I'm kind of open to taking on a little bit of age too. I'm okay trading for a guy like Dak Prescott. I'm okay going for Kyler or Lamar, even if I don't necessarily want to win. I think that there's the risk that you can alleviate by trading for one of those guys, but you really just have to get it as the core piece of the deal. You have to say, I'm trading away this early first. Keep in mind, early first. What else do I have to add? Can I add a win now piece? Can I add a win now running back? It's going to be almost an impossible deal to pull off. It's probably going to have to be the other right fit manager that goes, I have Dak Prescott on my roster, but I don't really have a contending team. I'm looking for picks. And if you can sell them on the early first, I think that's where I'd go first to try to sell my picks. Otherwise, I can't think of a lot of other ideas to sell unless you really, really can get like top 18 startup value for one of these picks. It's just really hard to move. I mean, I've been racking my brain literally for the last couple of days going, how would I even trade one of these picks? Because I have of my 56 teams in my portfolio, I have like 5 or 6 teams where I have other people's firsts, and a couple of them are really high. And it's usually a league where I maybe have like 23 firsts and they're clustered together. But I go, you know what? One or two of these is going to be really high. Now, I might not be 100% sure which one it is, but I can probably spot the ones that I think it's going to be right now. And those picks are almost just impossible for me to trade away, given that there's still an element of randomness to the rest of the league. So when I go and try to shop it and I go, hey, let me trade you my early 23 first, wink, wink, they're probably saying, well, that could be like outside the top 4. I'm not going to give you that type of value. So it's just really hard to pull off those deals. I know this wasn't like a ton of actionable information, but I guess my conclusion is just if you have these firsts, it's really hard to move them. And if you're looking to buy more of them, you really have to be convicted on what I was talking about earlier, coming up with a valid and sound process of how to judge range of outcomes for teams. So maybe you look at just the warp places. I mean, Adiko_FF has some great warp data. Just literally search his Twitter name along with WORP, and you'll get a ton of posts that explain warp, and it kind of shows you what I'm talking about. Literally just look at the areas on the graph where the position matters the most. And you can easily see like what is suboptimal or what is optimal to have on your roster in your starting spots, where it's most important to have an advantage and where not. And you can kind of think about, how do I attack that with these picks? And that's kind of where I would leave it, is unless you're able to attack with these picks, that type of trade, it doesn't really make sense to go out there and shop these picks when you think they're going to be really, really high. And if you're trying to buy them, back to what I was saying, look at the warp graphs, spot those teams that don't have these pieces, spot those teams that have a lot of depth, but they don't have an elite tight end. They don't have elite quarterbacks. Maybe they don't have one or two high-end running backs, or at least running backs you could see a high-end range of outcomes. They kind of just have a limited upside roster, and a couple injuries. They go from the 107, 108, they can sneak in the playoffs, to wow, my team is frustrating. Because again, these teams like this typically don't have the most flexible assets either. So they get a couple injuries, all of a sudden their depth of 14 or 15 deep, but they don't have a top 15 asset on their team. That team is between a rock and a hard place, because they have a bunch of assets that they could trade, but they also kind of realize that they're trading just to trade. You know what I mean? Like, they're not getting peak value for their assets, and they almost come to the conclusion on players like Josh Jacobs or David Montgomery. Like, those guys can help you win, but go try to trade them, especially mid-season. There might be one or two teams that's interested, and that's contingent that they haven't been hurt, that they're smashing in the current season. But you can't really trade those guys for what they're worth for your team. So it's one of those rosters where almost the answer to 80, 90% of their trades is, I'd rather keep this guy because they're worth more on my team, and just trying to push it in and sneak into the playoffs. Those are the teams you want to target. I think you look at the warp data and try to figure out, okay, what teams don't really have this type of build. Those are the ones you go after their picks now when it looks like their picks are mid-first. And if you sneak one of these into the top 2 or 3, you end up with essentially like top 2 startup round value next year. So the early picks, conclusion, try to get them when nobody else sees that they're going to be there. Don't trade them away. And with that, I hope everybody enjoyed this series of Dynasty Leverage, talking about the 23 picks. Obviously, it is still before the 2022 season, so a lot can change. College football season can change, which players are inserted here. I think that's the one thing to take away, though. A lot of this data is cumulative mock data, and it's based on positions. I'm not really certain which names are going to be here, but I tend to think the template of what the class looks like based on what I talked about is going to generally be what we get next year. So with that, I'll go ahead and sign off. You can find me at Charles Chill FFB, at Dynasty Chill Pod is my podcast. Obviously, Trades in 5. Thank you to Clay for the platform. Find him at Trades in 5 on Twitter. Find Dynasty Pandemic on the app. Download the Dynasty Pandemic app in the App Store. And then finally, if you want a roster review, myself and Shane Manila from Trades in 5 and Mannequin Chill fame also do roster reviews. You'll get about a half-hour roster review. We literally will go through like dissecting your roster, finding trades, finding where you can improve on roster construction, just overall general feedback. So contact Clay at Trades in 5 if you're interested in that. And I hope you enjoyed this series of Dynasty Leverage. Be chill.